You wouldn't believe how it began. Not with something dramatic, not with a loud moment that forced attention, but with something so ordinary it was almost laughable. That's how these things creep in, quietly, unnoticed, slipping past you before you've even realized anything's wrong. It was just one small detail at first, something easy to dismiss, the sort of thing you blame on being tired or distracted. Then it happened again, and again, each time slightly harder to ignore, each time leaving behind that uncomfortable feeling that something wasn't quite right. The people involved weren't careless, and they weren't imagining things either. They were certain of what they'd seen, what they'd done. But reality didn't match up. Things weren't where they should have been. Conversations didn't line up. It was subtle, but deeply unsettling. And what made it worse was the silence around it. No explanation, no clear cause, just this growing sense that something was shifting in a way no one could control. That's when it stopped being a coincidence and started feeling like something far more serious. Then came the moment that changed everything. The point where it was no longer possible to brush it off or make excuses for it. Because patterns don't lie. And once a pattern reveals itself, you can't pretend it's random anymore. There was structure in it, timing that felt deliberate, as though everything was happening with purpose. People began comparing what they'd experienced, trying to piece it together, but the more they looked, the more tangled it became. Sleep didn't come easily anymore. Every small detail started to feel important. And the worst part wasn't what was happening around them. It was what was happening inside their own heads. Doubt crept in slowly at first, then all at once. Not just doubt in the situation, but in themselves. In their own memory, their own judgment. When you reach the point where you can't fully trust your own perception, that's when things become dangerous. Because hesitation takes over. You question whether to act or stay quiet, whether you're overthinking or actually seeing something real. By the time they accepted that this wasn't normal, it had already gone too far. What started as something small had turned into something that couldn't simply be fixed or explained away. And the ending, it doesn't tie things up neatly. There's no satisfying resolution, no clear answer that makes everything make sense again. Instead, what's left behind is something far heavier, an awareness that doesn't go away. Because once you've seen something like that, you don't just forget it and move on. It lingers. It changes how you look at things, how quickly you trust what's in front of you. The people who went through it carried on with their lives, at least on the surface, but underneath, something had shifted. They noticed more, questioned more, paused where they once would have moved on without a second thought. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of it all. Not what happened, but how easily it could happen again. How something so small, so ordinary, can slowly unravel into something you can't control. The story doesn't end with closure. It ends with a quiet understanding that not everything is as stable as it seems. And sometimes, by the time you realize that, it's already too late to turn back. Then came the moment that changed everything. Not suddenly, not all at once, but in a way that crept up and settled in before anyone could push it away. Up until then, there had always been an excuse, something reasonable to fall back on, a way to convince yourself it wasn't as serious as it felt. But that stopped working. The pattern became too clear, too precise to ignore. It wasn't scattered or random anymore. It had rhythm, timing, a sense of intention behind it that didn't sit right. People started talking, properly talking, comparing details they kept to themselves before. And that's when it got worse. Because everything lined up in ways it shouldn't have. Things happening at the same time, in the same sequence, repeating just enough to feel deliberate. Sleep became difficult after that. Not because of fear exactly, but because the mind wouldn't switch off. Every moment replayed, every detail picked apart, trying to find where it went wrong or what had been missed. And slowly, without anyone noticing at first, doubt began to settle in, not just about what was happening, but about themselves. Memories didn't feel as solid. Decisions felt uncertain. Even the simplest things started to carry weight. That's the part no one prepares for. When it's no longer just about what's happening around you, but what it does to your own sense of control. By the time they fully accepted that this wasn't normal, that something genuinely wasn't right, it had already taken hold in a way that couldn't be undone easily. What started as a small, dismissible detail had grown into something far more serious. Something that wasn't just unsettling, but quietly, undeniably dangerous. The ending doesn't arrive with noise or clarity. It settles in slowly, almost unnoticed at first, like something shifting just beneath the surface. No one gets the moment they were hoping for, no clean explanation, no final piece that neatly pulls everything together. Instead, what's left is something far more difficult to deal with, a quiet understanding that whatever happened isn't fully over, not in the way that matters. Life moves on. Of course it does. Routines pick back up. Conversations return to normal. And from the outside, everything looks exactly as it should. But underneath that surface, something has changed in a way that can't be undone. The people who experience it carry that shift with them, not always in obvious ways, but in the small pauses, the second thoughts, the way they hesitate just slightly before trusting what's right in front of them. It shows up when something feels even slightly out of place, when a detail doesn't sit quite right, when a moment lingers longer than it should. They don't react the same way anymore, don't dismiss things as quickly, because they've already seen how easily something ordinary can turn into something they can't explain. And that's the part that stays with you. Not the event themselves, but the awareness they leave behind. It changes how you look at everything. You start noticing patterns where you once saw coincidence. You question things you would have accepted without a second thought. And even when everything appears completely normal, there's always that small part of your mind holding back, waiting, watching. Some of them try to ignore it, to convince themselves it was a one-off, something strange but ultimately harmless. And for a while, that works. They fall back into routine, distract themselves, push it to the back of their thoughts. But it never fully disappears. It comes back in quiet moments, late at night, in familiar places, in situations that feel just slightly too similar. And when it does, it brings that same feeling with it, that same weight that can't quite be explained but is impossible to ignore. Others don't even try to forget. They accept that something happened which doesn't fit into a simple explanation, and instead of forcing it into one, they live with the uncertainty. But that comes with its own cost. Because uncertainty doesn't sit quietly forever. It builds, it lingers, it changes the way you respond to the world around you. You become more careful, more aware, sometimes even more distant, not out of fear exactly, but out of caution. Because once you've seen how easily things can slip, how quickly something stable can become uncertain, you don't take that stability for granted anymore. And perhaps the most unsettling part of it all isn't what happened back then, but what it suggests moving forward. The idea that something like that doesn't need a dramatic beginning or clear reason. It can start small, almost invisible, building slowly until it's impossible to ignore. And by the time you recognize it for what it is, you're already part of it. That's what changes you, that realization. Not the shock, not the confusion, but the understanding that control isn't always as solid as it feels. That there are moments where things don't line up. And no matter how hard you try, you won't always find an answer that satisfies you. In the end, there's no clear finish, no sense of closure that lets you put it behind you completely. Just a quiet, lingering awareness that something shifted, something real, and that once you experience it, even briefly, you don't go back to seeing things the way you once did. And maybe that's what makes it stay with you the longest, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was subtle, controlled, and just real enough to make you question whether it ever truly ended at all. And just when it feels like everything has finally settled, like whatever it was has faded into the past and no longer holds any weight, there's always that one moment that unsettles everything all over again. It doesn't arrive with noise or urgency. It's quiet, almost insignificant on the surface. A small detail slightly out of place, a moment that lingers just a fraction too long. Something that most people would brush off without a second thought. But for you, it doesn't pass so easily. It catches your attention in a way that feels familiar, and that familiarity is what makes it uncomfortable. Because you've felt it before. That same hesitation, that same pause where your mind refuses to move on as quickly as it should. And in that moment, you realize something important. It was never really about one situation, one explanation, or one isolated experience. It was about how easily something ordinary can shift into something you can't quite explain, without warning, without any clear beginning or end. What makes it stay with you isn't fear in the usual sense. It's not panic or chaos, but something far quieter and far more persistent. It's the awareness that settles in the background of your thoughts, shaping how you see things without you even noticing at first. You begin to take your time with things you once rushed through. You notice details that would have slipped past you before. You question moments that seem just slightly off, even when there's no solid reason to doubt them. And while everything around you might appear completely normal, there's always that small part of your mind that holds back, that refuses to accept things at face value. It's not that you're expecting something to go wrong. It's that you now understand it can, and that understanding changes everything. Over time, you try to settle back into the way things were, to convince yourself that you're overthinking, that not everything needs to be questioned. And sometimes, that works. Days pass without anything unusual. Life carries on in its usual rhythm, and it almost feels like you've left it behind. But then, without warning, something small pulls your attention again. A pattern that feels too familiar, a moment that mirrors something you can't quite forget. And just like that, the same feeling returns, not stronger, not louder, but steady and undeniable. It doesn't demand your attention. It simply waits for you to notice it.